It's now my real pleasure to introduce our main speaker for the conference, Jonathan Kuttab. Jonathan is an international human rights attorney practicing in the United States, Palestine, and Israel. During his distinguished career, he has co-founded several human rights organizations, including Al-Haq and Nonviolence International. He serves on the board of Bethlehem Bible College and is president of the board of the Holy Land Trust. Jonathan was also the head of the legal committee negotiating the Cairo Agreement of 1994 between Israel and the PLO. In the last few months, he's become the new executive director of Friends of Sabeel North America, who we work in very close partnership with. Jonathan, it's a delight and a privilege to have you with us today. We thank you for getting up very early in the morning to address us. During Jonathan's talk, the presentation will be turned off, and we'd encourage you to switch to speaker view so that Jonathan can be central in your screen. Over to you, Jonathan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, it's really good to be with all of you, and that you are committed on the question of apartheid, specifically from a Christian religious perspective. I want to start by saying that the word apartheid for a long time was just used as a pejorative. We hate South African apartheid, and so we label the Israeli policies apartheid as a way to say that they are evil, they are oppressive, and eventually they will disappear from the face of the earth, just as apartheid disappeared in South Africa. However, over the years, the word apartheid obtained a very specific legal definition. And there were three documents that were important in doing that. One of them was the Geneva Convention, obviously, which mentions apartheid as a specific war crime and a crime against humanity, which is not allowed under international law. A second document was the Convention on the Elimination of Apartheid and all forms of racial discrimination. And the third document, very important document, is the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court and which specifically lists apartheid as one of the bases for jurisdiction for that court. I know that sounds like a lot of legal gobbledygook, but my point is that today when we use the word apartheid, we're no longer necessarily referring to South Africa. We are referring to a specific war crime that is clearly defined under international law. And like all crimes, it has a number of elements that have to be fulfilled for the crime to actually occur. And the three elements, very important elements of the crime of apartheid have been spelled out in international law. They are not a question of opinion. They are not a question of political commentary. They are not a question of debate. They are legal requirements. The first requirement is that there has to be a system of separation of a group or groups of people on the basis of religion, ethnicity, race, etc., by one dominant group. So separation, in Hebrew, the word is hafrada. The separation wall is called Geder Hafrada. The idea of separating non-Jews from Jews is one of the three essential elements of apartheid. The second element, very important, is a legislative and administrative system that turns this separation into a legal structure. It's not enough that you simply don't like Black people, or don't like Arabs, or don't like Palestinians. There has to be an administrative system that makes it by law a separation, that by law grants certain rights or benefits to one group at the expense of another, that by law requires people to live or act in a certain way, by law provides separate roads, separate legal, separate courts, separate educational, separate system by law for one group at the expense of others, in order for that one dominant group to dominate the others. The third element, very essential element, is that there have to be a number of practices to enforce and to enable this system, including torture, collective punishment, restrictions on movement from one place to another, use of imprisonment very extensively, the system of monitoring that right now governs the lives of people in the occupied territories. So these three elements have to exist. Simply the fact that you are violating human rights of Palestinians is not enough to create apartheid. All three elements must exist. There has to be separation, there has to be a legal system providing for the separation, and there have to be inhuman practices enforcing this system. Now, most of the discussion around apartheid, unfortunately, takes place in the political arena. And it takes the form of comparisons between Palestine, in this case, and South Africa. And you have some of the apologists for the Israeli practices who say, wait a minute, this is different from South African apartheid. This particular feature that existed in South Africa doesn't exist in Palestine. We provide certain things for Palestinians that were never provided for people in South Africa. But that misses the point, because no two systems are alike exactly. And in fact, comparison between systems is usually unfair. In some cases, it's unfair to South Africa because the practices in Palestine are much worse in certain respects than the practices were under apartheid South Africa. For example, the use of secret evidence. A South African friend of mine who was a lawyer said, what do you mean secret evidence? This would never pass muster under apartheid South Africa. So what are really the features that are distinguishing Israeli apartheid? It used to be a simple thing to point out to the occupied territories where two populations live, Jewish who live in the settlements and the Palestinians who live in the rest of the area. There, the case is very clear. They live in clearly separate areas. They live under a separate legal and administrative and economic regime. And of course, it is oppressive because there's a military rule that governs the whole area. But it has become very clear now that the issue is not only the areas that were occupied in 1967, but the entire state of Israel, including the occupied territories, the entire area between the sea and the river, today houses two separate groups, Arabs and Jews. And they live under two entirely different systems. If you're a Jew, you can live anywhere in Israel or in the occupied territories and have a certain set of laws and privileges and administrative structures, education, social benefits, health benefits, roads, laws apply to you in terms of and movement, permission to move, to go back and forth, that apply only to you as a Jew. But if you're an Arab, you live under entirely different systems. And this is very important, because one of the features of Israeli apartheid is fragmentation. Israeli apartheid has fragmented the non-Jewish Palestinian Arab community in the entire area into 4 different categories. At the top of the heap are what's called Israeli Arabs, who are Palestinians who hold an Israeli citizenship. And yet they do not enjoy equality in Israel itself, because Israel defines itself as the state of the Jews, not the state of all its citizens. And those who call for Israel to be the state of all its citizens are viewed as enemies of the states. One of them, Azmi Bishara, had to flee the country. He was a member of Knesset because he believed Israel should be a country of all its citizens. So that while this group enjoys the right to vote for the Israeli Knesset, they hold little or no political rights and are systematically discriminated against as Israeli citizens. There were about 63 laws that were created in Israel specifically granting privileges to Jews, which are not granted to Arabs who are citizens. And this was topped by the Israel nation state law, which as a constitutional provision declares Israel to be a state of the Jews, and that only Jews have the right of self-determination in that state. But that's the top of the heap. The second category are the residents of East Jerusalem. There's about 300,000 of them. These people are residents of Israel, but not citizens of Israel. Since the illegal annexation, Israeli laws and administration apply to them, and yet they are not citizens. They don't vote for the Knesset, and if they move outside of Jerusalem itself and live in Bethlehem or Ramallah or Kufr Aqab, they could lose their residency status. So they have a little less rights than Arabs who are Israeli citizens, but certainly much more than the rest of the Palestinian population. The third group, about 3 million of them, are the residents of the West Bank. They live either in Area A or B, and some of them live in Area C of the West Bank. They are under direct military occupation. Some of the rights of running their daily lives have been delegated to the Palestinian Authority, but they continue to live under occupation. They cannot travel around without permit from the Israelis. They cannot move from one area to another without permission. Building licenses, all aspects of their lives are really run and controlled by the military government. The fourth category, probably the worst, are the people of Gaza. There's about 2 million of them living in this very narrow strip. They cannot move in or out of Gaza, not to the West Bank and not to the outside world, unless they do it illegally, go through tunnels. They can't have products come in or out without Israeli permission. And Egypt is complicit because they control the southern portion of the Gaza Strip, but they are like literally in an open air prison where they have basically no rights. I could add a fifth category, which are the Palestinian refugees living outside who have zero rights in Israel, not even the right to come and visit, much less live there, much less have full rights. So if you're a Jew anywhere in the world, you can go and live in this area and immediately become a citizen, immediately be provided with housing, work, training. You even taught Hebrew if you don't know Hebrew, and you are a full citizen of this area. If you're not a Jew, if you're a Palestinian, then you have a whole variety of obstacles to even enter, to continue to live, or to travel around in the occupied territory. So fragmentation is one aspect. Another aspect is a regime of permits and licenses. Just about everything you can imagine doing in Israel or Palestine requires a permit, either a collective or an individual permit or license. And these permits are given or not given based on what's in the interest of the dominant group. And even when they don't have an interest in preventing you from doing something, they still use that as leverage to force you to do what they want you to do. Otherwise, you don't get the permit to go visit somebody, to get medical help, to travel in and out, or do anything that requires a permit through military government. And these permits are very discretionary. Israel can give them or not give them as it chooses. A third aspect of this hafrada, the system of apartheid, is limiting where you live, the area in which you are allowed to live and the area in which you are allowed to build. And these are not just zoning requirements, which every country has. These are deliberate requirements that are based on the imperatives of the dominant group. What is in their interest? What is it that they want? Where do they want to restrict you in terms of living and in terms of building? A fourth aspect is collective punishment. Collective punishment means you can punish the entire group for what one or more members of that group do. And that is practiced throughout the occupied territories, but mostly Gaza is the best example. Somebody sends one of these balloons, some of these fire balloons, and then the entire Gaza Strip gets punished, gets bombed, their fishing rights are restricted, the limitations on what they're allowed to get or not get are even tighter, made tighter and tighter and tighter. Collective punishment itself, collective punishment is a violation of international law. Then there is also a regime of constant surveillance, both individual, personal, electronic, and from the air. You have drones that are constantly flying over Gaza, especially, but also much of the West Bank. There is continued surveillance, which Israelis learned about only after the pandemic. They realized that every phone, every electronic device is basically a spying device. And these devices are being sold now to the rest of the world, having been battle tested on Palestinians. Now, I know I have given you a lot of information, and I'm sure if you will be hearing more from Omar and Rifat about how this impacts the daily life of people. But I wanted to focus us on the important point that apartheid is not just a defamatory term that is used about the Israeli policies. It's a strictly legal term. It is a war crime and a crime against humanity. And soon, I hope the international community will gather enough support and enough courage to be able to bring the state of Israel and its politicians, as well as its officers, to justice in international tribunals for the crime of apartheid. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back everybody to the conference. I hope you've all had a chance to grab a quick cup of coffee, and looks like we've got some really brilliant questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite Miranda, who is one of the members of our Board of Trustees, to ask a few of these questions to Jonathan. And what we'd suggest you do is that we'll stop the screen sharing again and that you switch to speaker view so that you can again see Jonathan and his full responses. Over to you, Miranda.
Right, I hope you can all hear me okay. A lot of the questions are quite similar to each other. And I suppose the thing to start with is many organizations are still very afraid of using the term apartheid, though it is becoming more mainstream. And how do we get our government, the British government, to accept that it is a situation of apartheid, and perhaps even to support, at the moment they're claiming they won't, the ICC case against Israel? It's a very difficult one. So many people are afraid of using that term. And in relation to that, it's sort of two questions in one. What about the Israeli public themselves? Do they accept that they have a situation of apartheid?
Well, actually, in Israel, it is not very controversial. They realize it is apartheid, and they say, so what? Israel was created as a Jewish state. It is supposed to privilege Jews by necessity, it was created to help serve Jews at the expense of non-Jews. So they don't like the word apartheid, obviously, because of its connotations and because of the illegality that is involved. The first part of the question is a harder one because international law, just like regular national law, is largely built on compliance and acceptance. You can't have a policeman and a magistrate at every corner of every road. The public has to know that you drive on, in your case, the left side of the road, and that you stop at red lights and stop signs, etc. You follow the laws of the traffic laws, and police there are for exceptions, and the courts are for exceptions. But what really holds society together is law. A similar process occurs with international law. International law exists because countries live by international law, because you cannot have the rule of the jungle. You cannot have a country simply take over its neighbor just because it's stronger or because it has some security or historical rights. That would be chaos. This is, by the way, what was so strange about President Trump accepting the annexation of the Golan Heights, because it just throws international law into absolute chaos. There's 194 countries in the world today. Most of them have problems with their neighbors. You can't just have every country invade its neighbors just because they have some good excuse for it. Now, Israel, and to some degree the United States, have been trying to water down that respect for international law. There will always be those who violate international law. The question is, does the international community do something about it? That is actually the value of BDS, is it takes something that everybody knows to be wrong, which the governments aren't willing to do something about, and you have churches and students and unions and other civil society sort of forcing government to comply with or to force compliance with international law.
I have two related questions to that. One person asks about settler colonialism in relation to apartheid, how you would compare those and contrast those two statements, you know, the wording.
Settler colonialism is of course a sociological historical term describing what happens when mostly European white settlers not only colonized in an imperial fashion the different colonies, but actually settled there and made that their home and lived as lords and masters of the indigenous population, either ethnically cleansing them or dominating them. And perhaps the last two examples, the most recent two examples of this are South Africa and Israel. So the Israelis don't like that type of analysis. It really puts them in a very bad light. Apartheid, however, as I explained earlier, is no longer a controversial issue. It's no longer a political, sociological issue. It's a legal issue. Just like slavery is no longer permitted. There was a time when that was allowed. Today, it is not permitted. If it's practiced somewhere in the world, it can be brought to the attention of the international community that this is wrong, that this is not allowed. Torture is not allowed. It's a crime, regardless of who does it and who is the victim and who is the perpetrator. So there are some principles of international law, and one of them is apartheid.
You apply the term to Israel itself as well as the occupied territories. Israel likes to call itself a democracy. Is there a definition of democracy? Because if, as you say, Israel, it gives more rights to Jews than non-Jews within Israel, under a legal definition, can it actually be called a democracy?
Well, some people refer to it as an illiberal democracy when it comes to within the 67 borders. What I wanted to say is that things have shifted. We no longer can speak about Israel separately from the occupied territories. The so-called two-state solution, which is something I believed in and worked very hard towards as a compromise, is no longer possible. I've put in the chat box a reference to a booklet that I recently wrote called Beyond the Two-State Solution. And you can download it for free from this website, from the Nonviolence International website, in which I explained that the two-state solution no longer works, that after 50 years of occupation, Israel has been in charge and in control of the occupied territories twice as long as it has not been. Israel was created in 48. In 67, the occupation started. We are now in 2021. So the occupied territories are now an integral part of the state of Israel. So Israel can claim it's a democracy because it allows elections for its Arab citizens who are 20% of the citizens of Israel. But in terms of the entire area, it's been more than half a century now. And today, between the river and the sea, there are two groups, Jews and non-Jews. And that's what we mean when we say the entire area is an apartheid state.
You mentioned the hierarchy of Palestinians and those that have more rights and those that have fewer. And you did bring Gaza into the equation towards the end. Hamas is often accused of being the main problem for those living in Gaza, although Hamas is a product, not the cause of the situation. How would you describe the influence of Hamas on the situation for those living in Gaza?
Well, I'm no apologist for Hamas, obviously. However, the idea of demonizing Hamas, just like the demonization of the PLO used to be, is basically an excuse for Israel to continue doing what it wants. In fact, Israel is very happy that Hamas exists in Gaza, separately from Fatah, which exists in the West Bank. In fact, Israel has a strategic interest in maintaining Hamas and not allowing Hamas to collapse any more than allowing the Palestinian Authority to collapse. It is part of the structure of fragmentation and atomization, which is a feature of apartheid. Israel needs Hamas to be in Gaza, but not to be too strong. Maybe part of the process of dealing with Gaza and with Palestine should be to end the demonization of Hamas, to bring Hamas into the discussion and into the picture, because you can't deal with Gaza without dealing with Hamas. They represent, at worst, 1/3 of the Palestinian population who would vote for them. So you cannot deal with Palestine, certainly not with Gaza, without dealing with Hamas.
And what about the Palestinian Authority in that case? They stopped having the elections. Part of the blame was put on Israel for not allowing East Jerusalem to be part of those elections, which is very anti-democratic. But what do you think about the prospects of an election and the Palestinian Authority actually themselves allowing that?
Well, right now, elections are not being suggested. For many people, myself included, the Palestinian Authority was sort of like a first step towards statehood when we were thinking about the two-state solution. It had its problems, it had its deficiencies, but at least it was a state in the making. Over the years, it became very clear that that was not going to happen, and maybe that was never intended to happen. That the role of the Palestinian Authority was to be a subcontractor for the occupation, to get a small elite, give them certain privileges, and require them to control their own people. Just like Hamas is now required to control its own people in Gaza. And to the extent that it fails to do that, then they can be hit, they can be held responsible. They are the best alibi for Israeli occupation. Just like in apartheid, there was an attempt to create Bantustans and to give them self-determination, give them passports, give them flags, even support their membership in the United Nations. Yeah, and the whole world says, no, this is nonsense. This is just an excuse. What you want is to continue to dominate South Africa, and that's not allowed. It has to be one person, one vote. So in many ways, the Palestinian Authority today and the two-state solution today is the alibi for continued Israeli occupation and apartheid.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Miranda, as well. And just very briefly, Jonathan, a few people had written in the chat, and I think it was a question that I really had for you as well. And I'd like you to sum this up for us in 1 minute, if that's possible.
Okay.
Where is the hope for the future?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the hope for the future is that Apartheid, like slavery, like the Iron Wall, like many dictatorships, even though it appears powerful at the time, everybody knows it's going to collapse, it's going to end. This is the hope that we live by. This is our faith in the ultimate sovereignty of God. Our feeling that history is moving forward, that oppressive regimes like slavery, like apartheid, will one day end. People don't remember that even 100 years ago, women didn't have the vote in the West. Can you imagine? And that's only one centuries ago. 120 years ago, Black people were bought and sold as chattel in the United States. So how long can Israel maintain an apartheid regime while pretending to be part of the Western democratic world? I don't know. But I know it is going to end. When, I don't know. How, I don't know. But I am perfectly sure it will end.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. What a wonderful way to end, giving us some hope for the future and all the hard work that I know a lot of people here have done over many years seeking justice for the Palestinians. Thank you so much as well, just offering that critical analysis of Israeli apartheid, the legal perspective. I'm sure we've all learned an awful lot, which we can use to help us here with our campaigning in the UK. It's now my pleasure to welcome our partners from Palestine to the conference, Omar Harami, who is the Director of Sabeel Jerusalem, and Rifat Kassis, who is the General Secretary of Kairos Palestine. As I mentioned earlier, our partnership with Sabeel and Kairos is at the heart of everything we do here in the UK. And therefore, it's only right that you get to hear directly from them about their work on the ground with communities in Jerusalem, Israel, and the West Bank. We're not going to have time for questions and answers with Omar and Rifat, but you will get a chance to ask them things at the workshop they're running, which is called Voices from the Ground, later in the programme. And I know, having spoken to both of them, they're looking forward to having a great discussion with you there. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over first to Rifat, who is going to tell us about the work of Kairos Palestine. Thank you, Rifat. And Rifat, I think you're going to need to unmute if you're talking.
Can you see me and hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Charlotte. First, I really would like to thank Sabeel-Kairos UK for inviting us to their annual conference and giving us the chance to address you today to speak about Kairos national and international work. Actually, as you got from Jonathan's presentation, we Palestinian Christians are an integral part of the Palestinian people and engaged fully in the common affairs of Palestine and very much involved in the struggle for liberation from the colonial occupation and apartheid. We are equally aware of the serious confusion, I would say, and controversiality within the global Christian community on the issue of Palestine and Israel. And it was clear, I mean, from some of the questions raised to Jonathan. We also realize that we as Palestinian Christians were and still are the victims of an exclusive racist theology that some churches adopt and did not help Christian communities to engage in the struggle for liberation of Palestine and the Palestinians. The Palestinian Christian in 2009 launched the Kairos Palestine document, calling for ending the Israeli military occupation and apartheid by using nonviolent means like BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which was also mentioned in the presentation, and to work for a just peace in the region. The document was unique for its clear analysis, vision, directions, and action-oriented, and got a lot of attention and triggered a lot of positive feedback, but also some negative ones. The experience of Palestinian Christians leaders writing together was repeated in 2017, when all reputed Christian organizations in Palestine, together with Kairos Palestine, drafted the open letter to the World Council of Churches and to the global ecumenical movement, explaining the urgency of the situation and that we are on the verge of a catastrophic collapse. And this could be our last chance to achieve a just peace. Jonathan spoke about the ending of the two-state solution. Personally, my biggest fear is the ending of the peaceful solution, not just the ending of the two-state solution. And we are seeing this is happening right now. This open letter had 9 recommendations for churches to implement. Unfortunately, the situations which motivated us to release Kairos Palestine and the open letter are still there and motivated us to release, together with our partners from Kairos for Global Justice Coalition, including Kairos Sabeel UK. And this happened on the 1st of July last year, 2020, the call, Cry for Hope, which was mentioned in the presentation early in opening the conference. This Cry for Hope had 7 recommendations directed to the ecumenical movement. The document was translated into 13 different languages, endorsed by more than 400 Christian leaders and scholars, organizations, and churches, and was supported by around 22,000 signatures so far, and still the signing campaign is going on. We send the call to many churches and ecumenical bodies and write them that the church has to acknowledge that it is not immune to racism and acceptance of oppressions. And there are many forms of racism exist inside the church practices. We added that so far the church was part of the problem and had to be part of the solution. The church has to repent, as Kairos Palestine wrote in 2009, and take actions. We concluded that the mission of the church has to be prophetic. And if she does take sides, it is with the oppressed, to stand alongside them. We explained in the Cry for Hope, and we said, it is a personal call to all Christians, local parishes, and national churches to take actions and to engage in a process of study, reflection, confession, and actions concerning the deprivation of the rights of the Palestinians. It is an invitation to our fellow Christians to learn more about the situation and engage positively and do something regarding the denial of Palestinian rights, to confront theologies and understandings of the Bible that justify the oppression of the Palestinian people, to support Palestinian resistance, including boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and demand that governments and world bodies employ political, diplomatic, and economic means to stop Israel's violations of human rights and international law. And Jonathan did great work in paving, all this. Also oppose equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and support initiatives between Israelis and Palestinians and interfaith partnership that oppose apartheid and create opportunities to work together for justice and equality. And finally, come and see the reality on the ground, to stand in solidarity with grassroots initiatives for a just peace. We got tremendous responses from different parts of the world. And we need to acknowledge that there is an increased participation from churches and Christians worldwide in the struggle against occupation and apartheid. The American churches' divestments and boycott resolutions, the United Church of Christ resolution identifying the oppression of Palestinians as a sin and identified Israel as an apartheid state are just some examples. And there are more initiatives growing. The Global Kairos for Justice Coalition, which was created a bit prior to the launch of Cry for Hope, accepted the Cry for Hope as the coalition manifesto and managed to lead several dialogue initiatives between Palestinian theologians and global church leaders in UK. You mentioned something about it. Sweden, India, Sri Lanka, USA, Korea are just some examples. we organized many initiatives protesting the forcible displacements in Sheikh Jarrah and in Al-Bustan in Jerusalem, where clergy and lay people conducted the solidarity and protest visit. And I mean, our friend Garth, he spoke about this visit and it was inspired by this visit in his songs. We also issued a petition, and this is something very important to say, together with some other Palestinian and American institutions, signed by 315,000 persons. Our aim was 20,000, but we reached 315,000 persons. This is just to give you an example about the change in public opinion. And this petition was directed to the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, demand Israel to stop all plans of illegal expulsion. And you saw this in the film by Al-Kurd. We also managed to organize tens of webinars, workshops, and conferences where the Palestinians got the chance to speak about their suffering and hope. We conducted events to protesting the war on Gaza, the continuous grab of land, settlers' violence, killing, maiming of innocent people. And all these are just examples of the work we did. I'm about to finish, Charlotte. I just want to speak about the Christmas alert, which we are going to issue this Christmas. And this time will be titled with, "We all created in God's image." And it will talk about the unity of the Palestinian people wherever they are, the West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, inside Israel, or in the diaspora. We are one nation, deserves to enjoy the right to self-determination. Today, the coalition, and I will end here. Today, the coalition, our coalition exists in more than 40 countries in all continents and still growing as a strong sign of solidarity and fellowship. We need to continue building on this progress made by Palestinians themselves and our partners, and to follow their directions in working for justice. And finally, and this is really finally, we still believe that Palestine is the priority. And without peace and justice in Palestine, threat to the global peace will continue and remain. We said in Kairos, we believe that our land has a universal mission. And thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rifat. Omar, can I hand over to you, please, for 10 minutes about Sabeel Jerusalem?
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Last year, like the rest of the world, we were all caught by surprise with COVID-19. And COVID-19 has introduced a number of challenges in addition to a number of opportunities. Since COVID-19 has affected the Christian community the most in Palestine, specifically the people who are living in East Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Nazareth, which rely very much and heavily on tourism and pilgrimage, the economic situation of our community has deteriorated. Along with the churches, there are close to 400 Christian-related organizations, and they were all affected because if the people are not able to work as guides or as bus drivers or the souvenir shops, they're not able also to pay for the tuition of their children in Christian schools, which most of them attend. So our work has been very much focused on coordinating the little resources that were available to help and support the different communities and a number of intervention projects within the community. But also COVID brought opportunities. Israel has, for many years, Israel has banned the licensing of Palestinian tour guides because they do not want them to be spokespeople for the Palestinians or sharing the Palestinian narrative, or specifically also the Palestinian Christian narrative. And so it was an opportunity for us to work with over 650 Palestinian guides. We've almost, actually, as we're speaking now, there are 2 tours led by Sabeel, working with the Sabeel, and re-educating Palestinian tour guides on the Palestinian narrative, on Palestinian Christians, Palestinian liberation theology, contextual theology. We've also had meetings on really improving the knowledge and the statistics and the facts on the realities on the ground. So it has been a very fruitful year. because we were able to touch most of the guides, and there has been great impact done in this area. But also this has really enabled us to benefit from Zoom. I know many people are zoomed out and they're tired and exhausted from Zoom meetings. But since last June, we've had almost weekly meetings with Kumi sessions that I see many of you have already attended, that spot the light on a specific topic or a specific organization that is relevant to Palestine and Israel. Also, we have our Thursday worship services that we do it with the founders of Sabeel and Palestinian Liberation Theology. This has really increased the capacity and the knowledge of people on Palestinian Liberation Theology. We're happy to share the links if you are not aware of them, so that you may join them. But also Sabeel has really started to introduce in Palestinian Liberation Theology, Kumi theology, which means inspired by the story of Talitha Kumi from the Gospel of Mark, that speaks about a little girl that Jesus when everybody thinks that she is dead and it's hopeless, Jesus says just, Talitha, little girl, rise up. And this is why we started to introduce Kumi Rise Up projects. We've been in less than a month, before less than a month, we have launched a health insurance scheme, a self-insurance, health insurance project. And in less than a month, we have close to 2,500 people who have joined it. That's huge. This is for the Christian community to help people overcome the challenge of covering medical costs. And this is really an inspiring project. It might be in the first month, maybe we've reached the benchmark of having like the biggest community initiative throughout the world in the last century, happening by Palestinian Christians today. So this is really inspiring. We're overwhelmed. We meet with 2 or 3 parishes a day. There's already 56 organizations and schools engaged with it, major universities. It's really inspiring. We have done a bad job promoting it or informing our friends abroad about it. But we have also similar projects that are going to be taking place in the coming 2 or 3 years, inspiring and powerful projects. And this is very much connected with our theological work, because in the last few years, or maybe 2 decades, our attention has been under this assumption: if only we educate our brothers and sisters in Christ, when the UN failed us, when political parties failed us, when the Arab countries failed us, when the Muslim world failed us, when everybody failed us around the world, we did it as the scripture says. We turned to our brothers and sisters in Christ. And a lot of work has been done with BDS and advocacy work abroad. But we have all neglected somehow looking back into our own community and focusing outwards, especially to the developed countries in Europe and in the States. We have neglected and ignored our local communities, which many of us somehow we have failed, and we have lost our faith in ourselves and maybe in God too, because our salvations was connected to our brothers and sisters abroad, which is something that is understandable. It's something that it wasn't done by intention. So now we are focusing back on our local Christian community. And when we're looking back into the Christian community, we're helping people to regain faith in themselves. And this is why the health insurance system is a project, is a similar project that fits this. Now we're also facing some challenges also theologically. Unfortunately, like many of our local community, like many of the churches abroad, when they think of Palestinian Christians, they think of this needy church, a church that is in need, is under the threat of being extinct, facing so many challenges. We need to protect it. And that has become a problem for our community. And what we are trying to change is that we are a needed church. We are a church that needs to also have a space and have a chance to lead, to participate. We have things that we want to contribute with. We are not only just on an endangered species list. We are still valuable, and we think this is where Christianity started, and we still can contribute to the revival and to the strengthening and to the beautiful diversity of the church globally. This is a great part of where our attention is going theologically at Sabeel. And Sabeel has been also being engaged with new pressing issues that are also affecting our friends internationally. Big part of it is that it's when there are the IHRA definition and all of the discussions that are happening around the world regarding to anti-Semitism. Sabeel has been intensively studying this topic for over 2 years now. We have lots of material. Our final work is being with an editor, just language-wise, and it should be published-wise. But we understand, unfortunately, it's like the Balfour Declaration. When the Balfour Declaration happened, they said, they did not even refer to Palestinians by our name. They said Israel needs to respect the rights of the people who live there. They did not refer to us. However, when it comes to the anti-Semitism topic, when you look at the IHRA definition or most of the important definitions that come with anti-Semitism, and the church is and the church should be looking and engaging it and looking internally and re-examining its theology. And whenever there is interfaith discussions, always how the issue of Palestine comes and the issue of Israel comes up when the discussion of anti-Semitism comes up. And unfortunately, Palestinians are always discussed. However, we are not part of the discussion table. That is extremely problematic. We understand nobody is immune from being anti-Semitic, but when the church is engaged with anti-Semitism, the topic of anti-Semitism, they must also understand also the Palestinian education. It's good for the churches, and they should engage with the topic of anti-Semitism, also Christians, advocates, and so on, but also the people who are engaging with it. As long as Palestine is a major part of the discussion, they also need to be doing an internal study and learning about the Palestinian narrative. And similar to this, there are also plenty of work that is being done with the church. There are many big discussions. Unfortunately, our Christian, or fortunately or unfortunately, there's opportunities and there are dangers. If you look at historical Palestine, the Holy Land, today it is Christians, somehow we are close to 500,000, which is double the size of our indigenous community, over double the size of our indigenous community. Now there is a growing Christian community that lives in Israel who are the descendants, or who are either the expatriates or the people who have immigrated to Israel as Jews. We have a specific cornerstone issue that we're talking about it. And somehow it's very sad because most of the Christians, this has never happened even at the times of the Crusades, that the majority of the Christians in the Holy Land are not the indigenous community. And this is really affecting, is causing so many discussions within our own community, within the international community, within the advocacy work, and unfortunately has been very much ignored. So we are engaging with this, with similar also pressing issues when it comes to the theological landscape in Palestine and Israel today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omar and Rifat. I can just see the comments, in the chat, just saying, this is so inspiring. This is, to hear about your heart and your passion for your own people and how that's such a key part of what you do. This is why we love to take our steer from you. We love to talk about the work that you do and to tell all of our supporters how important it is inside Palestine itself. So just a big thank you to you both for joining us. Thank you for all your continued perseverance, hard work. We're here as a community to support you in that and to stand alongside you. So we're very grateful for that relationship.